on. And what I want to do today is I want to take global warming and try to understand what the governments around the world, and it's not every government, but most of the governments around the world are trying to do here. And you put up a wonderful video of basically understanding how the government and how NOAA records the temperatures of the Earth. And it seems like we're getting, a contradiction of how this is done and, what the readings really mean. Are these readings manipulated? Can you just give us a brief summary of how the temperature is recorded here on the Earth and why are we having these problems of understanding the temperature?
Well, I think this is one of the key questions because it is just taken for granted, I think, when we engage in this debate, that it is simply a fact that you can measure, like going out and measuring the temperature with a thermometer, that you can measure the global average temperature. But, of course, a moment's thought will let you conclude that, no, of course, you can't go out and simply just directly measure something as diffuse and ephemeral as the idea of a global average temperature. So how do you actually go about constructing such a number? And it is a construction. It is not something that can be directly measured in the sense that we're thinking about. So it really is, there's a few different ways of doing it, and so there are different data sets from which a global average temperature number is constructed. And interestingly, although there is a global average temperature that is given by one of the data sets, most of the data sets actually only deal with an anomaly, i.e. a difference between the temperature that's being recorded and an average temperature that has been constructed over some arbitrarily selected period of time. So you might say, for example, that the global average temperature anomaly over the past 135 years of the modern instrumentation record is 0.8 degrees Celsius, i.e. the temperature has risen 0.8 degrees over that period from the statistical mean derived from a period that uses as a reference 1961 to 1990 if you're referring to the Hadkrut dataset, or 1901 to 2000 if you're referring to the NCDC dataset, or 1951 to 1980 if you're using the GISS dataset. If this is all becoming a bit confusing already, then this should give you at least an idea of how much more complicated the issue of trying to measure this warming is than we generally take for granted in the uncritical news reporting that surrounds this matter. So that's I guess, in a nutshell, that opens the possibility to some of the problems with these types of records. And it's important to note that there are different quality classes of temperature data sets. You have satellite temperature data sets, which measure the lower tropospheric temperature, and these are considered to be the most reliable temperature data sets. These are the UAH and the RSS temperature data sets, the University of Alabama Huntington, and RSS is another satellite record. And then you have three data sets which are constructed from global surface temperatures, which are, again, themselves largely fudged numbers. These take a lot of different data points from different weather stations around the world and try to average them out in some way that is supposed to be statistically representative of even those areas of the Earth which these data are not coming from, the places that don't have weather stations. So there are different ways to do that, depending on how you whether you take an average between two different weather stations that are separated so many miles apart, and then just cover that across the area, or whether you weight one of those stations more than the other, and then multiply that problem a million times over to try to cover the entire globe, including the vast large surface of the globe, most of which isn't covered by these types of weather temperature stations. And again, you get an idea of the complexity involved here. And as I say, there are three data sets that try to do that. There's one called the Hadkrut surface record, and then there's the NCDC and GISS surface records. And these are of a lower quality class than the satellite temperature records, which can at least take direct measurements of the lower troposphere.
So you said something very interesting in your video, that as they're doing the readings of these temperatures, I think it was 6% is coming from the United States.
Yes, right.
And they're using this to project the warming of the world.
Largely, not completely. I don't want to say the exact numbers
Mm.
because I don't have them to hand, but it is something like the United States covers something like 6% of the land area of the
Right.
Earth. But it is vastly overrepresented in terms of how the temperature data set is constructed. I want to say the GIS temperature data set, but I can't remember which one it is. But it is heavily weighted towards temperatures that come from the United States, which themselves tend to be particularly unreliable. There have been numerous adjustments that are made to the GIS data set and how it calculates the temperature anomaly, which one would expect as processes are refined and as statistical analysis becomes more in depth. You can get hopefully a closer and closer approximation to the real temperature record. But the strange thing about the adjustments that are made to these temperature records is that they always seem to adjust the temperature in the distant past downwards and the temperatures in the recent past upwards. So that if you can wrap your head around this concept, the 1930s, for example, used to be a lot warmer than they are now, in the sense that the temperature adjustments that they make to these data sets always pushes the temperature of the 1930s downwards and then pushes the temperatures of the 1990s and 2000s upwards to make them look warmer in comparison to the 1930s than what would have been the case if these adjustments had not been made. So there is statistical trickery going on, and there are adjustments that do have some basis in the real world. There are bases for the adjustments that are made, but the adjustments that are made by the National Climatic Data Center, the NCDC, are generally peer-reviewed by other government scientists at other government agencies. So there is no real outside verification of these adjustments that are being made, and it just has that interesting effect of making the warming seem more pronounced than it would otherwise in pretty much every case across the board that you can find. The temperatures of the past go downwards and temperatures of the present or near present come upwards.
And what's very interesting when you were talking about the warming in the past, and they're telling us it's continually getting hotter, but when people, experience the winter, they're seeing more snow, they're seeing colder temperatures. Last winter was absolutely horrific in many different areas. Not every single area, but most of the general areas, it was very, very cold, very, very snowy. And of course, as we know, if we go back in time, they told us that snow was going to be a thing of the past. We're going to have melting icebergs, and all of this was going to happen. I think this was going to happen in the year 2000 or something, and here we are in 2016 now, and we're not seeing any of this. The question I have, though, is why is there such a push to convince the world that the world is warming?
Well, I think it's even more nuanced than that, because I wouldn't. First of all, I think we shouldn't use our personal sensory experience as some sort of definitive guide to the global average temperature and what may be happening globally, because of course weather is not climate. And when people say that, they're usually saying that in the context of, oh, those global warming deniers, they have a cold winter day and they think global warming isn't happening. But I would apply it equally the other way around. On a hot summer day, you have the global warming believers coming out saying, look, it's global warming because it's hot outside. No, neither of those conclusions is justifiable from the premises, and we should not take weather as climate. And I would say that the question of whether the globe is warming or not is completely contingent on over what time period you are talking about. If you take as the beginning of your time period for measuring that, say the 1850s, 1800s, and 1700s to the present day, there is no question. No one who has any familiarity at all with the historical record would dispute that the Earth has been warming over that time period, since that was in the depths of what's become known as the Little Ice Age that took place around the 1700s, and we started pulling out of it in the 1800s. So obviously, since that time, the Earth has been warming. But if you look at it at different periods of time, the warming effect may be more or less pronounced. which is something that, again, people tend to point out on these when they're trying to debunk the scientific skeptics. They will say, oh, look at these deniers. They only look at this period of time, say from 1998 until the present, and say, look, global warming has paused. But they're only saying that because 1998 was an unusually warm year. So if you cherry pick that start date, it looks like there hasn't been a lot of warming. But again, there is no such thing as not cherry picking a start date for this, because it just depends on where you start the graph. And so the people who are trying to show that there's been some unusual, anomalous warming period in recent history will generally start their graphs in the 1970s, because that's most efficient for them, because since the 1970s there has been a period of warming. So I think the debate has been largely stuck on stupid for a very long time, with people just not even really understanding what the debate is about. I mean, again, depending on what time scale you're looking at, no one really disputes the fact that the globe has warmed. The only question is, well, to what extent has man played a role in that? And again, no one is really disputing that man plays some role on the climate, even if only from the albedo, from the urban heat island effect. There are changes made to the landscape by land use of humans that does make some difference. The only question is it a detectable difference? Is it a notable difference? Is it a difference that's causing some sort of alarming trend that's going to cause the end of the world as we know it? And I think that's where the debate really should be concentrated. Unfortunately, we just get debates that tend to spin around in circles. But why has none of this nuance ever been brought to you by the sort of the mainstream media, even the popular science publications that try to put this debate in front of us? Why is it always 100% so heavily weighted towards the science is settled, there is no questioning of anything that the science gods, or who has been anointed to speak for this supposed consensus is telling us? Why is there no debate allowed on this? Why are they so adamant in trying to convince everyone to swallow the entire thing hook, line, and sinker, and not to question anything about the fact that the emperor appears to be naked? And I think this has to be seen. There are different layers of this, obviously, and I think obviously not every scientist who is working in these fields is part of some conspiracy where they're trying to hide data or things of that nature. There is such things as the noble cause effect, where people who genuinely believe that they are working towards something that is noble and notable and worthy for humanity will overlook pieces of data that are not coherent with that narrative. And of course, there are monetary reasons that some people will skew for certain things, and there are also questions of scientists that have now put basically their entire scientific career on the line by staking their claim in this area, so they will never backtrack on it until they ride the entire hoax down into the ground, really. But I think more so from than the scientific perspective, I think the social forces that are driving this, and over top of that, the funding of the massive amounts of funding that are coming at this issue, and the massive amounts of funding that rely on the continuation of this issue, is where we can start to get a grasp of where this is heading. And I mean, just as an example of that, what we saw in Paris fundamentally was a conclusion of a global climate fund that by 2020 is going to be transferring $100 billion per year from the developed nations to the impoverished developing nations that are going to be most hardest hit by climate change, or so we are told. Anyone who believes that any significant amount of money is actually going to reach anything resembling the average person in Tuvalu or wherever else is clearly just living in la-la land. This is going to end up in the pockets of the bureaucrats that are creating these systems and the corrupt kleptocrats at the top of the various countries that are in play here. So I think that the monetary incentive is the layer on top of the scientific layer that explains where a lot of this is coming from and what it's being driven by. And on top of that, I think that if you really peel this back down into the core of the onion, as it were, the layer at the very bottom of all of this is truly a layer of control. Ultimately, what this represents is the demonization of something that is absolutely fundamental to life itself.